I'm Cole Haddon, and welcome back to 5 a.m. Story Talk. Today's guest is a lawyer, an author, and one of Australia's most influential digital rights activists. I'm talking about the brilliant, the inspiring Lizzie O'Shea here, and we're about to discuss how to fight back against, everything in the 21st century.
There's this idea that, politics is downstream from culture. Cultural interventions are so critically important in helping us understand what is going on, but what also might be possible in shaping people's expectations of people who hold power and how to facilitate holding them to account.
Welcome back, Story Talkers. For the past month here, I've been focused on the world of film and TV, from the threat to diversity and inclusion in Hollywood, to my horrific experiences creating a TV series called Dracula for NBC and Sky back in 2013, to an epic conversation with writer-director Scott Derrickson that I loved every minute of. I hope you did too. But as many of you know by now, 5 a.m. Story Talk is about a lot more than just looking at the arts and artists. We also explore the major challenges facing our society today, since it's the job of the arts and artists to contend with and help us make sense of them. On occasion, such guest work even has implications for the art world. And that's certainly the case today. Lizzie O'Shea can be described as many things. A lawyer whose work has helped transfer $5.5 billion from corporations to their victims in class action lawsuits. An author and advocate for the victimized and marginalized. And perhaps most germane to today's conversation, a digital rights activist. In fact, she's the co-founder and chair of Digital Rights Watch, which advocates for freedom, fairness, and fundamental rights in the digital age. AI's threats to our personal rights and way of life, and the artist's life, by extension, is a big part of that work. But maybe the best way to describe Lizzie is as a human rights hero, which is also how the organization Access Now described her in 2019 when it celebrated her. Now, when I asked Lizzie to join me for this chat, I wasn't sure what to expect except to be constantly on the back foot. And that's exactly where she kept me, with a kind of polite but aspirational grace, challenging the cynicism about the 21st century that I constantly wrestle with. And I expect you do too. It's hard not to feel that way these days. But Lizzie doesn't have any interest in hope as just a noun. For her, it's a verb. It's a call to action. There's a beautiful line in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring, spoken by the elf Galadriel. Even the smallest person can change the course of the future. And I've thought about those words a lot since my conversation with Lizzie. A quick heads up before I get started. When this episode wraps up, you're going to want to stick around. That's because I'm going to tell you how to listen to my bonus app with Lizzie. She returns to discuss a seminal, well, maybe not seminal. She has some thoughts on that word, as you'll learn. So let's say a foundational piece of art from her life, Gustave Courbet's perpetually controversial 1866 painting, L'Origine du Monde, or The Origin of the World in English. One more thing. If you enjoyed this episode from 5 a.m. Story Talk, be sure to subscribe so this podcast keeps showing up in your life. Okay, are you ready to be inspired? Let me introduce you to lawyer, author, digital rights activist, human rights hero, Lizzie O'Shea. Welcome, Lizzie. It's so great to have you here. I've been looking forward to this conversation in part because I think I take some strange pleasure from brilliant people making me feel like I'm not remotely as informed or clever as I hope I am. So are you ready to make me feel a little stupid?
That is not my objective here today, Cole, and that's not the impression I have of you, but I'm happy to do my best to have a lovely conversation, which I'm sure will occur.
Well, so this first question's a bit long-winded, but in the intro, I told my listeners a bit about who you are, and we're going to come back to that. But I thought maybe we could start with a big question. 40 years ago, the world was still in the midst of a Cold War, which in reality was just one of countless threats to the everyday life of people around the world. And it was something we experienced on the nightly news while most of our concerns were focused on local communities. But today, the internet and the immediacy of social media have ensured every event everywhere is something we personally experience, must form an identity, defining opinion about, and be willing to fight with strangers about. So do you think human beings are struggling with an empathy problem because the internet has made them care so much it's broken them in some way? And what I mean is, how can we fight back against anything when it often feels as if we're trying to fight back against everything?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe that as an empathy problem. And in fact, I feel like what we see also is an overabundance of empathy in the 21st century. I mean, I have a very strong memory of being quite small, like maybe 4 or 5, and I think it was before school, but my parents told me that there were bombs that could blow up half the world. And I remember not being able to sleep thinking, this is terrifying. How do we make sure these things don't go off? But in some respects, what we see now is kind of that revelation almost on a daily basis. Like, you are bearing witness to all sorts of terrible atrocities all around the world. There's a looming threat of climate catastrophe. A whole generation of young people have grown up with significant uncertainty, a growing demonstrated gap in wealth, so huge wealth inequality, failure of democratic institutions to respond to some of these challenges. And then what we've also seen is an explosion of community, sometimes very niche, sometimes broad ranging connections across those traditional social divides that have otherwise in other previous iterations of society might be unable to be bridged, but in fact are now able to form communities across these boundaries because of technology. So I see there being an explosion in empathy as well as an explosion in the exposure to the realities of the world. I think working out how to respond to that meaningfully is a huge job, and it's something I think about every day. And I know lots of people in my space and people everywhere around the world ponder these problems. But I think they're the right problems to be pondering, and I want more people to do that work. And it feels like, for me at least, that the internet can be an amazing place to facilitate that. There are things we can do to make it a place that is more like a brain for solving problems rather than a weapon for oppressing people. And that's the kind of internet I would like to see. But I certainly think I have a huge amount of faith in humans, in both holding empathy for others, even in circumstances where they may not have a direct connection with that person, and also be interested in solving the world's problems and making it a better place than when they arrived. That's, I think, a very common aspiration, and it's why I like people.
I think I certainly struggle with this idea, you know, in the past, if you wrote about World War II, obviously the Nazis were more than Hitler. But Hitler, there was some sort of figurehead. And now the threats, they seem so decentralized. And as a storyteller, and I've chatted about this with many storytellers, it's difficult to even work out how to talk about these subjects, and we're in part supposed to be the people who do. That's part of the role of artists. And so I think about the average person who has so much more than what you were describing as a kid, which is I had too. My dad loved to scare the shit out of me about that. I worry about what we've done to our brains, I guess, with how much. I mean, it's not that we've done it. Obviously, it's reality. But how do we contend with a reality that is so overwhelming thanks to the internet?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think hope is some moral thing. I actually just think it's like a political responsibility that you've got, right? So you've got to find the ways in which solutions to problems presenting themselves and work out how you can collaborate with people who are interested in solving the world's problems. You've got to figure out how you can do that either at scale or in the micro, what might be your best contribution. So, I mean, I don't think it's a moral thing to say I want to wake up every day and figure out whether I'm using what I've got available to me in a way that I think would be most effective at trying to attack and address some of the problems we face and do what I can to be a source of solutions. Like, it's in a very abstract way, I suppose I'm talking about this, but I think that should sort of be our orientation, not because we think it's the right thing to do on some innate spiritual level, even if it is, but just because that's our job as humans. I remember I read, I don't make a habit of this, but I did read a review on Goodreads. I'm not even a member of Goodreads, of one of my books, and somebody was complaining because they said, oh, the problem with this book is she just seems to really think that humans are not inherently bad. And I was like, guilty as charged. If you don't enjoy reading from that perspective, I'm not the book for you. So I have a huge optimism. It's like that Gramscian idea. I have a commitment to being realistic about where we are and the problems that we face. And I also kind of think about whether these are the worst problems we've ever had. And it's hard to go around something like climate change. And particularly in the context of tech, it's also now hard to go around that, where tech is now a contributor to that in recent years in a way that it wasn't previously, say. The tech issues and the climate issues are really serious problems for humanity. It's hard to imagine a historical comparator with that, to be honest with you. And then I think to myself, well, we are a species that is good at problem solving, that is good at adapting. Let's look at how we can make that work. Like, it's sort of your job in the face of such immense crises to work however you can. I don't think I'm always effective. Part of what I think being an advocate is understanding what failure is, because most of the time no one's going to say to you, you won this, congratulations, good job. It's not like being in a relationship with a person who cares for you or looks after you or encourages you. A lot of the time being an advocate is, in that formal sense, quite an unrewarding experience. But I actually find it some of the most important work that I've done, because I can see long-term trends that I feel not just me, but people I've worked with have contributed to shifting whole mindsets about particular ideas or phenomena, right? So you've got to find the way in which you are having change, and also, like, if you failed, figure out how to, that's a path that you shouldn't take again. That's something we've learned. Let's go on to the next thing, right? So it's that kind of optimism of the will in line with that pessimism of the intellect, I think, contributes to spending your life in a way that might at times feel very hopeless against such immense challenges, but gives you the fortitude and I think some of the resilience to continue on, notwithstanding that, because it's your job that you've given yourself.
We'll talk about your advocacy in just a moment, but perhaps I should reframe why I was asking those questions up front, or about that existential dread, which isn't so much pessimism as much as trying myself to understand long-term trends in terms of art, where art, I monitor this. I track things like our affection for dystopian fiction, as these things intensify in relationship to things that are being experienced perhaps on the internet, and dwelling on our artists contributing in some way. Are we preparing in some way for the fall via some sort of culture surrender over what we're producing? And that's where those questions come from, just trying to understand on the part of artists what they're doing other than just reflecting the dread. And that's I guess part of this podcast is trying to have a conversation about the tension between those two things, the hope, but also how do you address the despair? How do you confront that? Which is tricky.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question from an artistic practice perspective. So we'll talk about this later. I appreciate your focus on art, but in selecting an artwork, and I'm not this artist that I wouldn't hold myself out as an artist, but what I am is a choral singer. So I used to sing professionally in choirs and still occasionally do. And, we're going to talk about art later on, but one of the things that I'd mulled over was whether choral music is actually one of the important things in my life. And I went to a seminar recently with someone who was doing democracy measurements who, because there's a lot of comparison around democracy. There's questions around the year of elections last year where more people than ever before voted in an election. And then what we have is what looks like a democratic backsliding. And someone pointed out that, in fact, what correlates with democracy it tends to be on these measures, which are contested and the like, is that the more choirs you have, the more likely you are to be a democracy, which I think is such an interesting observation, right? Like, people involved in artistic practice in a communal setting, it does not surprise me they're also invested in a system of negotiating difference, of debating topics, of understanding how to find common ground, all that kind of stuff, right? So I was sort of fascinated with that metric. It's probably just correlation, but I actually think there is something alluring about those two data points. And, the history of art is a lot of art has been produced in service of patrons, for example, who can afford to fund this kind of artwork. And then there's a lot of amateur art, a lot of people doing it in their spare time that actually, I think, builds up the kind of neurons of a collective brain that makes for a good society. And that creative practice is I think, an essential part of being human, right? And so I think art is something that is a human activity that has to negotiate, the production of art has to negotiate with wealth and power, but it's also a way in which you can understand the complexity of the world that is almost unparalleled. It's got, there's this idea that, politics is downstream from culture. I think culture is so influential on how politics is practiced. And cultural interventions are so critically important in helping us understand what is going on, but what also might be possible, and shaping people's expectations of people who hold power, and how to facilitate holding them to account. So there's a huge responsibility put on artists, I think, to be the explorers of the collective brain of society. And it's a difficult job because they're not always doing it in conditions of freedom, shall we say, or at liberty to do it in ways that they choose. But I think it is more important than ever that they consider that responsibility really carefully, and work out how to, make the cracks bigger so the light comes in. And also make sure that art is a practice that is for people, not just for some purist ideal that is elitist, that actually art in practice has a huge influence on how society operates. And that's something for everyone, not just for the select few who would call themselves artists.
We should switch gears and get into your biography, because not every listener out there can identify your accent. So where in the world are we located today?
Yeah, so I'm currently living in Melbourne, Australia. I've lived in lots of different parts of the world over my time, but I've spent the most amount of my life as a litigator in the Australian legal system, and also as an advocate on numerous different topics. But probably the one that's most relevant to your listeners maybe is in respect of digital rights. So for what it's worth, Australia has a wonderful legal system in some respects. I think it's got some interesting things that work really well for people, but it's also got some failings, as all legal systems do. But we don't have any rights instrument in Australia. We don't have a human rights charter. We don't have a Bill of Rights in the way the United States does. And so we are the only liberal democracy in the world that doesn't have a rights instrument. So I'm doing a lot of work kind of trying to discuss what rights looks like in the absence of that being reflected in the legal system. But I think that is where kind of cultural ideas of rights become very prominent, like what it means to be a citizen in society and what you're entitled to expect, both of lawmakers and also in industry, for example. So the other thing I've been doing is I've been acting as a litigator in Australia. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I've been most of my life in practice going to court, suing people. And I act as a plaintiff lawyer, and plaintiff lawyers sometimes get a bad rap for all sorts of reasons. But to me, it's been a real calling in life. I wasn't really interested in studying law. I found it quite challenging and dull. And then I arrived at a plaintiff law firm and I really felt like I came home. The law firm I work at came out of the union movement. So it's over 100 years old now. And it was started by a member of parliament who lost his seat. He was from the Labor Party, and he was quite a big figure in the Labor Party. He was opposed to conscription for the First World War, which kind of isolated him within the Labor movement. And he started his own law firm. And the idea of the law firm was that it would provide services to working people. And so that is personal injury work, industrial work, employment disputes and the like. And then in more recent years, it is what I do now, which is class actions litigation. We have in recent years, run a large number of very significant cases against large corporations who've done the wrong thing. That's resulted in a transfer of wealth of $5.5 billion now, I think is what we're up to. Money taken from companies who've done the wrong thing and given to people who've been harmed by that. And I consider that to be an amazing way to practice law. I find it very satisfying, interesting. I get to examine how companies get to the point where they're behaving badly. I get to argue with them all the time that they should compensate people, and I get to give some form of satisfaction to people who've been wronged, that the legal system will listen to them. I don't think we always get results that everybody wants, because litigating is really hard, and there's often the need for different kinds of policy solutions to these problems. But corporations do behave badly in our society, and it's very important that there are lawyers there to assist people where other mechanisms aren't there, to give them some form of redress. And that is basically what I do most days. And I find it, very rewarding and important. I think litigating is a last resort. Like, court systems are slow, they can, for good reason, that's how they make change. Like, it's not that criticism is sometimes leveled as being a problem, but I actually think that approach to rulemaking that is iterative serves a particular purpose. And it gives confidence in the law as well, and allows people to be heard, even in circumstances where the law might, in normal conditions, not go their way. They get to say that in this instance, it should be different, right? So I think there's a real role to play, particularly in the current world we're in, where courts are under attack in places like the United States in particular, that the legal system has that confidence built in. And I feel sometimes that we're a private practice law firm that is kind of trying to protect some of those things that are central to the rule of law: confidence in getting a fair hearing, the capacity to get your voice heard even in circumstances where you're tiny compared to your opponent who might be huge. And also, I get to look at some of these industries that have been really careless with how they've treated people, dominating in terms of how they've approached questions of market dominance and the like, and examine whether that conduct is lawful and what we think about it as a society. And those, I think, are very important questions that remain very current and are interesting, and I love doing it. I also then, do my advocacy work on the side because I think some things can't wait for judges to make decisions. We need lawmakers to make change. We need policymakers to approach these questions differently. But I've certainly seen the value in being someone who goes to court and argues for things to be done differently or for orders to be made to benefit people who've been harmed. And I wouldn't want to practice law in any other way.
On your website, you identify yourself as activist first before lawyer. Is that because it seems like a choice? Is that how you see yourself, and the law is just in service of being an activist?
Well, I mean, I do think if you're a lawyer, you've got to put your duty to the court above everything else. That's what's required of you. And so you can argue for change to be made to the legal system, but if you're litigating, you have to respect that the system exists in this format. So I'm a zealous advocate, but I see these jobs as kind of separate. I think if you're going to court, you're accepting the rules of the game and then you're having to work within them. And I think that may lead to a claim that you should change them, but it's a slightly separate argument, is what I would say. So I take my professional responsibilities as a litigator very seriously, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Do I see them as related? I mean, I just said I wouldn't want to do any other kind of law, and I think that's for a reason. I don't want to practice law in a way or get my bills paid by companies that I think aren't respecting laws, aren't good corporate citizens. I don't throw shade on others who do it, but I think where you choose to work is relevant. And I think there's lots of lawyers who do really important work in all sorts of fields, whether that's community law, it's working for government in different ways and the like. But I work in class actions and I sort of see it as an issue of class. I want to work for people who are otherwise not really capable of going to court. I'm not interested as much, or what gets me out of bed in the morning is not some intellectual niche question about how the law should resolve a topic. I think it's interesting, but what motivates me to practice law is that I think the system only works if people get proper representation and there is no one who's above the system, and that includes very, very large corporations, right? So I feel like I'm contributing to the system being functional by going to work every day and representing a certain group of people. And I also think part of what makes for a functioning legal system is having people who are reflecting on that and arguing for changes to occur. I mean, one of the cases that I remember the most, or that's been perhaps something that's marked my career since then, is that I acted for an abortion clinic in Melbourne. I mean, I remember this occurred in 2001. There was a security officer who worked at the front of the clinic who was murdered by an anti-abortion fanatic. I was at believe it or not, a university conference that was focused on feminism, and I heard about this event. I thought, that is so awful. It's not that long ago. It's in living memory, right? And then 10 or 15 years later, I was acting for that clinic, arguing for protection zones around the clinic to allow people to come and go from the clinic without being harassed by extremists. And that case, I was really passionate about it because I'd thought about it a lot, and I knew firsthand what the kind of consequences were for my client, at least, in having to experience that kind of harassment. And then what occurred was, of course, that we lost. We made the application to the Supreme Court, argued it out, and we went down. And it was hugely disappointing for the client. That is not a result that you want, right? But what we did then was we went to lawmakers and said, we've argued that this responsibility exists with authorities to do something about this harassment of staff and patients, but the law has said that's not the case in the current system. And so as a result, we're coming to you now as lawmakers in the legislature to change that law and introduce a regime to protect people. And that is what they did. We worked on that form of advocacy. Ultimately, that went all the way to the High Court because there's a question around whether it reflects a commitment to freedom of speech and association. We have limited rights in the Constitution that relate to that, no express right, for example. And the court found that it was appropriately balanced and that it was lawful, it was constitutional, which was a great outcome, right? But multiple forms of litigation, some forms of statutory law reform, with the aim of getting a good result for your client. And when I started that journey with that client, I think it was 10 or 12 years before it ended in the High Court, I remember thinking, I don't even know if this is going to work. Like, even if we get the law changed, even if we get a good outcome in the Supreme Court, and it has worked. There is no one now harassing people coming and going from that clinic. I'm not the sole reason for that, but it's interesting that the law has served its purpose there. It's set a different paradigm. It's reflected what people think about the issue, and it's gotten the situation changed. And that was partly a campaign, partly partly litigation, partly law reform. All of that works together.
Was this who you were at 14, 15? When did you become this passionate? Were you the 15-year-old at school with 10 causes?
Probably the answer to that is yes. I have a strong memory also of going to my first protest in my school uniform. Oh, God, I don't even know what I was thinking. My mum politely gave me a raincoat to put over the top of the uniform. She said, I'm not sure that the school will want you to be representing them at this protest. So it was a protest against the World Economic Forum. It was like right after the Battle of Seattle in the US, and there was a protest here that reflected similar kinds of values, and I went along. And so what would I say? Yes, I think I was like that. I'm from a family of lawyers, which I think helps, so we're always arguing. It's always respectful. We're also a family of people with, I guess, a commitment to unionism. So we used to have the kids' union, which acted against the parental oligarchy, and we negotiated our demands. So, a household in which that kind of conflict in a thoughtful way was very common. Someone also once described this as potentially a reflection of my Catholic upbringing. I mean, I've got a surname of O'Shea. I'm not actually Catholic. I don't think I may have gone to church once or twice. My parents are definitely lapsed Catholics, but I think I understand what that comment meant. Like, Catholics in Australia, all around the world, were isolated. Irish, I mean, I'm an O'Shea. Irish were isolated. They were treated as second-class citizens for a long time. And I think there's that perspective of being an outsider that gives you empathy with others, and also a desire to change the world so that people don't continue to experience that. I mean, the Catholic Church has got its own tortured history. I don't put them in the same bucket, Catholics and the Catholic Church, but I think it is interesting to reflect how that experience of marginalisation is almost like carried down through the generations. And even though I wouldn't have reflected that myself, I think it is probably a valid point. I don't know. I mean, I think there's problems in the world. You've got to do something about solving them. I feel best when I'm trying to create solutions. I'm not good with coping with despair, and I think putting it to one side kind of crushes a bit of my humanity. I think a lot of people feel like that, and I found the most joy and sense of possibility and hope when I talk to people who share that value. So I like being in those spaces with people who are thinking about these things, because it makes that despair about the world that is an inevitable feeling, I think, much easier to carry.
So we started this conversation talking about the existential challenges of tackling a world where crises are so legion in our imaginations. So in your case, outside of the legal work, would you say the digital landscape is the primary focus of your work today?
I would. And in part, that's because I think it's the most undercooked in Australia. So, I'm not a technologist. I don't have a technology training background or anything like that. I'm not qualified. In some ways, I feel like that makes it easier to work on these topics, because you're forced to learn, and you're forced to learn in a way that your audience or your constituents might have to go through a similar process. Like, thinking about how to understand technology topics in accessible ways, it's something I have to do myself. And so then it gives you the capacity to think about how others might do it as well. I saw with others that there was no organisation that advocated for this at a national level. There was no one doing this kind of work. And I was also just deeply, gravely concerned about the huge amount of power being wielded by these technology companies, and how this is really an ecosystem change. The whole technology landscape is an ecosystem with different interlocking issues, people, communities that might be affected. And it seems a big problem that we had no one talking about how human rights might fit into that decision-making, into that policy-making. And so I wouldn't describe myself as reluctant, but I saw a gap that needed to be filled. And, maybe that's me that's got to do it. And I have enjoyed that experience, because you find others who are also similarly extremely worried about the state of the world and the trajectory that technology is taking us. I think technology activists often get, or digital rights activists get accused of being kind of anti-technology or anti-progress or uninterested in the potentials of technology. And I suppose the other addendum I'd add to that kind of narrative of how I've come to this is I do think there's such an immense potential in networked computing, in analyzing large data sets using machine learning. I think there's huge scope to improve society, to disorganize some of the oppression that exists in our current world, to interrogate why systems operate in a way and design them anew. I think this industrial revolution offers that opportunity. So I'm holding on to that with both hands by doing this kind of work. People often use the term Luddites, which I think is wrong. I love the Luddites. I think they're a gorgeous little historical example of what we should all be doing, which is that they were resisting certain forms of automation in part because they found it dehumanizing. So the traditional way in which Luddites is used as a term of derision now is that people are anti-technology. But in fact, I think the Luddites were much more sophisticated than that. And I would put myself in that tradition, I suppose, someone who sees the potential of technology but is wanting to put it in service of humanity and does not think that's what's going on currently. That's too much of an opportunity to squander, in my view, and that's what pulled me into this space.
So I have a question about communication. There are so many new threats in the digital landscape that most people can't even comprehend. First, what are the challenges of communicating with people who don't know what they don't know? And what are the scariest things when it comes to human rights online that they don't know are coming their way that you're currently campaigning against?
Yeah, I think that's a valid observation. I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts about this as well, Cole, because like, for example, I'm a huge devotee of privacy. I think privacy is this foundational right through which so many other rights are able to be exercised. In the current environment in which we find ourselves, where data extractive business models are dominant, so you go onto a social media platform or you use any kind of online service, there's a huge desire to extract information from you because it's profitable. It allows for aggregation of that data for targeted advertising, which is a huge boom industry. Sometimes that's the same platform that you're using, if it is social media, for example. And then, of course, large data sets are now what is informing the development of AI tools and products. So the data extractive business models that we see are commonplace, involve multiple actors, some of which are unknown to people, particularly data brokers. And then also, when you talk about privacy, most people would say that they have very little privacy online. And there's this argument that is constantly put by, I think, short-sighted commentators that if you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide, that this is essentially harmless. And making that connection between some of the downstream consequences of data extractive business models, including, for example, growing extremism and polarization in online communities, or say even something different like cognitive offloading when it comes to using AI tools. What are the consequences of that? Or the capacity to micro-target. And so if you're a particularly vulnerable person for whatever reason, maybe you're addicted to gambling or alcohol and you can be micro-targeted by these companies or exploited through lookalike audiences. These are all very negative consequences that come from a violation of privacy. Or perhaps put differently, I think regulating for privacy, for strong privacy protections, is one of the ways to target that data extractive business model at its most basic. Because if you can stop the information being extracted, you get all these downstream consequences that start to be ameliorated. It's not a total solution. But if you say, oh, we want privacy reform, most people don't necessarily understand the value of that in all its complexity, or they think it's a lost cause, or they're told to think it's a lost cause. But interestingly, if you survey them, at least in Australia, it's an extremely popular idea. Most people want more privacy protections. So then you've got this added problem, which is that most people want it, but it is very difficult to turn that into a campaign that can pressure the government to do something about it, especially in a context in which there are significant business interests working against you. So I am always looking for ways to talk about how privacy is extremely important. I think storytelling is one of those ways. I mean, I'm a lawyer. Look at me. I'm like, everything looks very like laid out in evidenced arguments, but I'm not sure that's the most compelling. I mean, I don't know if what we need is different kinds of storytellers coming to the fore, but I think it is, as an advocate, one of the ways in which you do it. And certainly you can do that by having people tell their own stories. But I also do think you need the work of professional artists, of people who have a practice in art doing this kind of work as well. I mean, yeah, would you agree with that, Cole?
I do. I agree. The challenge that I've been spending a lot of time trying to work my way through lately is so many of the stories that are told are going to be conflict oriented. And conflict oriented always ends up leaning into the most, to use a tired word, but it's an accurate one, something dystopian. And
Yeah.
so if you're going to talk about the issues that you're discussing, it's about the worst case scenario, and it's never about solutions. It's never about what's on the other side of that. And so I worry, and this comes back to some of my framing of earlier questions, that the threat feels so abstract, that people throw up their hands so quickly. There is no sense that there's a solution to the problem. It's too scattered to tackle, and somehow we've already lost. And as a storyteller, I'm struggling with this because I actually become convinced that science fiction has largely failed us for this reason, because it tells us the dystopian, but there's no vision of what we're building towards. What is the consequence of the conflict if you win? What do you win? I don't know. We're not going back. So what's the vision of the world where anything you do succeeds? I think that is difficult to sell to people, because it's also not very sexy on a movie screen when somebody wants to spend $150 million making it. And so happy endings, I worry, have just become a really poor marketing tool for the gatekeepers, the billionaire
Yeah, and I think
companies.
also some of the solutions to these problems aren't always fun. They can also be hard work. Like, I think democracy, for example, is full of argument. It's full of negotiation. It's full of meetings. It's not as though a happy ending is a conflict-free society, or that's what we ought to aspire to, right? So part of it is that, I mean, I don't mean to say it's not the destination, it's the friends we make along the way, but the process of kind of understanding the problem does create the tools for its solution, which is that you have to work with other people, right? So from a storytelling perspective, I think that's a particular challenge, because what does it look like to create a different form of social media, for example? And I think there are experiments around the world like this. Like, Taiwan is one example that is commonly used in the work of Audrey Tang. She wrote a book recently called Plurality, which talks about this kind of issue with Glenn Wheel. And she talks about developing forms of engagement that start from the point of connection rather than the point of conflict. And that is an interesting set of examples. She's got lots of them. When she acted as the Minister for Digital Affairs in Taiwan, doing all sorts of projects about community engagement with technology. And it involves discussing particular proposals and having a negotiated outcome that not everybody gets their way all the time, but you've got some understanding of what other perspectives are, and that it is possible to facilitate that using technology. That, I think, is a kind of utopian vision, even though it's not without conflict. It involves a form of negotiated collaboration, of discussion and deliberation that is technology facilitated, that makes use of that kind of escalates and accelerates some of the difficulties that might be otherwise presented, because you can do it in a technological format. But it also does create, I guess, a blueprint, a kind of structure for how you might have these discussions in a more formal way. So I imagine, as a storyteller, me asking you to tell a story of how you can continue to have a conflict, but it's more managed or it's more democratic, isn't a particularly good happy ending. But I feel like there's scope to tell that story.
And there used to be the society, I think, and I think it's pretty well demonstrated, we've slid from a world where gray existed in a lot of our conversations. It's become very black and white. And even the ambiguity in a film or television series that you might have found in the 70s is not really an acceptable form of storytelling in Hollywood in particular. I write novels as well, and I'm finding that the pushback is constantly, we're looking for something that just makes us essentially feel good. We want to be able to read it on a beach. It can't be too challenging. It can't have that ambiguous ending. And it reflects, I feel, a culture that has abandoned the notion of compromise, that has abandoned the notion that it's okay not to win every single fight, every single time you walk out the door, that it's okay to win 2 of the 4 issues. Maybe in a few years, you'll win the next 2. That's how it's always worked. Why do you think this is the fight to end all fights? And that's reflected, I think, in the stories that a lot of people choose to tell.
Totally. It reminds me of like that Freudian idea that everybody, oh, no, I'm really going to be verbaling Freud here, but I think it's difficult for everybody to live in a society. Like you don't get to have all your desires expressed or acceded to, but actually it's always a compromise, right? I agree. The current mediated ways in which we communicate work against having a realistic understanding of that. It's mostly a sense of indulgence of all that you want is legitimate and you can curate your world to suit that. So the structures that exist don't serve that muscle well, and it's a skill. Like negotiating with others is a skill, working with others, living in a society with others is a skill. I think people do still do it, right, all the time in their families, in their community street organizations, in their local, in their workplaces all the time. So it's not as though I think we've lost the capacity to do it, but how you tell that as a story of success, I think, is a challenge. Yeah, I mean, I don't even, I'm not sure like kind of the ideals of hope or the like kind of really cut it either, but I think there is still, most people want to have relationships with others. We're humans that are social, like figuring out what works, how to manage and negotiate difference. Like these are all skills that we've got to develop. I'm not worried that the younger generation, despite being saturated in this kind of technology, have lost that. I think if you look at the data, like they're worried about the state of the world, but I think they still also are approaching these topics with quite a sanguine attitude. Like I think it's sort of interesting as well that parents of young people at the moment are perhaps the most anxious about things like social media and the like and these new online spaces and perhaps are the most addicted, and then that comes out in a form of anxiety about their children. And I think the basics are still there. We know what it is to grow up and be resilient, notwithstanding much of our lives will be spent in online spaces that don't help us build those skills. People will be able to do it. So, maybe there's also a timing thing that as we incorporate this technology and understand it for what it is, neither of this utopian, democratizing capability, which is how it was talked about in the early part of this century, nor is it an entirely dangerous space, or the internet is not an entirely dangerous space for which there is no good that comes out of it. But working how to walk that line, I think, is the challenge in telling stories about it as well as advocating for good policy.
Absolutely. I can't let you go from this part of the conversation without asking about AI. Will our likenesses be remotely protected? I don't think enough people spend time while talking about how great generative AI is, dwelling on the fact that they could end up a star in their neighbor's homemade porno. It's just, and what people can do with my kids' images. I'm less concerned about celebrities. Though I work in the entertainment business, I'm just concerned about the fact that, what people who like my son's face might do with it. And that terrifies me.
Yeah, that's valid. Or also say have decisions made about you by public authorities or financial institutions or employers all be made, and that your cards might be marked in a way that you don't even know about. And you've got no way to seek redress for, or that culture is flattened. I mean, I think that's the big concern when it comes to art and exploring people's artistic capabilities, that it gets totally flattened into a particular vision of what it should be that caters to a statistical majority. I don't mean that in a population sense, but, it's trending towards the middle because of the way these systems are designed, right? So what do I think about that? Like, I think there's multiple different ways to think about AI as a kind of magic technology or as something that's very practical and real. I think there's also ways to think about it as either an existential threat or something that is in the here and now, stripping people of their rights and dignity I think there's ways to think about it in material terms, like it's data or information, it's training systems, so it's computing power, which involves data centers and they're located somewhere with the associated environmental planning, whatever, issues that attenuate with that. And then also how it's applied and used and purchased and deployed in different settings. So when we talk about AI, what we often end up doing is having conversations where that's an empty signifier and it's filled with meaning by the person who's speaking, but in a concealed way, or by the person who's listening in ways that perhaps the person speaking didn't intend. So it's such a complex topic. It's like talking about climate change, right? I think it is a huge influential issue, and there's multiple fields of human endeavor, human practice, human life that it will impact. I remain very concerned that at the moment, key decisions about how that technology will be developed and deployed have been centralized and are being made by a very small coterie of men, mainly in the United States, right? So what does that mean for Australia if we want to regulate it in a particular way? How do we then do that if that's considered an incitement for a trade war with President Trump, for example? So it limits our capacity as a sovereign nation to make rules about how we want this technology to be deployed. I mean, more generally, I think it's not the case that the public is invited into these policy discussions in the way that they ought. Why I think that's important is Australia ranks as the most pessimistic when it comes to AI. I would say the United States is not that much better. But together with, I think, New Zealand and Finland, we're the least optimistic that AI will bring benefits to society. So if we're not prepared to do that work of building trust in those systems by inviting the public into discussions about how it's regulated, by having open discussions about both its potential and its limitations, then I don't think we're going to overcome that gap, right? And I don't think it works to just say, you don't really understand this tech, you should just tap out of this and accept that it's coming. I don't think that works as a strategy for bringing people along. But also, I don't think it means that the technology is deployed in a way that is the most useful or efficient or effective. There is research in Australia that one of my friends and colleagues in civil society has done, which looks at nurses' use of AI in their workplace. And it talks to a bunch of nurses about what that is, their literacy levels when it comes to what AI is and how it might be used, and then asks them to track how they encounter it during the day, and then asks them what they think should be the basis upon which it's used. And once they're required to think about it, their interest in the topic goes up. And once they finish, they had a bunch of suggestions about how it could be used better. And they were very keen to protect nurse to patient ratios. So they thought that the benefit of the AI systems should be to give them more time with their patients, because that's the most effective way in which they can use their skills. And that needs to be protected, right? So the productivity dividend, the efficiency dividend that comes from this kind of technology needs to be returned to workers, to patients, not necessarily just pocketed by companies that either sell the technology or a reduction in the wage bill, right? And I think that is one place in which I see a huge amount of potential, asking workers about how they can use AI better, involving them in the discussion. We often already have systems in place, like legal mechanisms for having that kind of discussion that can make it very meaningful. And it does mean that you have more people, more stakeholders to use the lingo in the conversation than just the seller, the vendor, maybe a government department, maybe a private entity. And I think you get better outcomes. Those are the kinds of things I'm looking at to try and make sure that human considerations are at the center of how this technology is not just deployed, but also developed, so that we don't just wait for problems to present themselves, like what you're describing with those deepfake kind of activities, that we proactively manage them before they can occur. And then we've got feedback loops where timely feedback comes to the people who can make a decision about it and change things, right? So that's not going to happen on its own. It's going to require that we demand that in the deployment of this technology. But what I think is present in that pessimism about the industry is, I like to think of it as a national asset, because it's actually kind of like, excuse my language, a bullshit detector. You know, Sam Altman is one of the greatest salesmen in the history of humanity. These companies selling these products are very good at selling them. And I think the fact that that's not always received uncritically, that in fact there's a huge barrier we're going to have to overcome to get people to trust this technology, that's good, because I think they have to earn the right to provide these products in a way. And part of that is having a feedback loop, not just imposing this technology on people and expecting them to suck it up. In fact, inviting them into the conversation in all sorts of different ways, however we may choose to do that, so that it can, in fact, be a better form of technology that is in service of humanity.
Fantastic answer. Okay, so last question for now before you come back to talk about a piece of art from your life. But I'm curious, what's the last thing that filled you with optimism for our future? And I'm talking about the fizzy kind, the kind that keeps you fighting.
What do I think is going right? I mean, one thing I am really worried about from my parochial perspective is the climate impact of the technology industry, which, it's a complex issue. Often AI products are sold as being a solution to some of our climate problems, but we just need 1 billion data centers set up that use natural resources like space, like water, like electricity, in order to achieve that aim, which strikes me as pretty contradictory. What I think is interesting is looking at how these are being rolled out around the world. In Australia, we just got an announcement that Amazon is investing $20 billion in Australia to build a whole bunch of data centers. And when you look at how other countries in the world have dealt with this, it's not always been a seamless activity. In fact, notwithstanding we're in the early parts of that kind of approach, as in building of data infrastructure outside of the United States to accommodate the data needs of the AI industry, we are already seeing resistance to that in all sorts of different formats. In the United States, movements to kind of resist data centers being built in particular neighborhoods, documentation of the harms that are caused. People are organizing way ahead of where we are in where I am, Australia. And I love to read that because I think to myself, that's the kind of lesson I can use. Okay, what have they done in the US? What kinds of harms have they seen? What are the considerations that ought to go into this? I mean, it's not that I put differently. I accept that there's going to be a need to build data capabilities and storage, and there may be good uses for that. But it's more like I've seen now that there's a whole bunch of people that have gone before me to tackle some of these problems, and I can use them as a blueprint myself. I'm going to be the beneficiary of that. Even places like Singapore, where Singapore has a whole industry around creation of these data centers, but they put a pause on planning approvals a couple of years back and only allowed further data centers to be built if they complied with certain kinds of clean energy obligations. And that even is an interesting example because it's a blueprint for a government to use, like in Australia. So what I feel excited about is part of my work is to talk to interesting people who are confronting the same problems as me, maybe on a different timescale. And what bubbles up from below is all sorts of interesting approaches to resisting the onslaught that is coming, for challenging those really powerful entities and organizations, and for mapping out how you can build an alternative. I find that exciting. And then I think to myself, you know what, this is not going to be a terrible experience where I go to the government and say, this may not be the best idea. I do it more forcefully than that, as you can imagine, but also that it would fall on deaf ears. I can instead collate these together and put them to government and say, look what other people around the world are doing. This is what you can expect if you don't take into account their views. So let's get ahead of the curve and do that now. And I just love finding out about these topics. There's not a day where it goes by that I'm not curious about how people have tackled these problems, and find it exciting to think that lots of people struggle with the same challenges I have, which is fighting off a sense of despair, fighting off resisting very powerful entities, and working out how to recruit people to the campaign that we can do things differently, right? The idea that a different world is possible. And, most days I see examples of that. That's the most recent. But on most days I see all sorts of examples like that. And I find that extremely inspiring. It's like the fuel that keeps me going. And it helps me to work out how we can create solutions, or how, even if it's not me, how you can create the conditions for solutions to start to arise. And I want to be part of that. It gives me an appetite for being involved in this.
God, I love that answer. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Oh, I mean, also, I just love talking to, I consider myself extremely lucky that I get to talk to people like you, Cole, because part of what I love is also you don't just talk to lawyers. I like talking to lawyers. It's the 99% of lawyers that make the rest of us look bad, but I do actually enjoy talking to lawyers and understanding how we think. But it's so interesting to talk to storytellers and artists and be able to talk to your audience as well, because those are people I want to work with. Like, I think it's not, it's such a privileged position to be able to make these connections and sticking your head above the parapet to say, I'm going to do this advocacy work. I'm going to be an advocate. I'm going to be an activist. I'm going to be a volunteer for this cause because I think it's important. You get to meet all these interesting people who are coming up with things differently. And I don't know, I mean, maybe that's why you do this podcast. I don't know, but I love this kind of capacity to meet and talk with different people from different disciplines.
It's in part why I'm doing it. I want to help people think a little bit differently about the world, often through culture. And that's my specialty. It's the thing that I know a bit about, at least from the inside of trying to make questionable culture contribute questionably to it. But yes, to hopefully give people language, to be able to articulate what's happening to them and even how to do something about it themselves. But I want to understand some of these things as well. What am I doing wrong in how I'm trying to express big ideas? Why have I contributed negatively to the discourse about literally everything by just meeting every problem with a hammer? And maybe that's part of why we've ended up where we are, because people like me cared so much, but we're kind of idiotic about the way that they went about it. I should have been more like you, but I didn't have that person in my life saying, do it that way. And I found my way to art. That's where I'm doing it now. But even there, I don't know. Am I doing it the best possible way? Am I the best version of an artist? But that's what this is.
But I mean, like, I don't mean to be facile about it, but I think if you're asking the question right, you're on the right path to begin with. And also, like, we will do things wrong. Like, I certainly regret ways in which I've engaged with people in the past and how dismissive I've been of other viewpoints. It's partly a function of age that I get to look back and realize that, that there was a different way to do stuff, right? But also, as I get older, I feel less concerned about worrying too much that you're making mistakes and just to try and carry on producing, doing something, right? Like participating, because it can be very easy to get yourself tied up in knots that if you're not perfect at what you're doing, you're failing, right? And I think it's a practice. Like, you have to practice being an effective advocate. You have to practice being an artist. Like, it's not something that is just given to you as a gift from on high. So that's what I love about being alive. Like, and also talking to people. Like, it's the experience. It's a journey, not a destination, shall we say?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm just trying to enjoy it a little and maybe end up a little bit smarter at the end of it. Fewer regrets, though I don't know if that's going to work out, but we're all trying.
Yeah.
As for you out there listening today, thanks for stopping by for some 5 a.m. Story Talk. So, what did you make of the conversation with Lizzie O'Shea? If you have any questions or thoughts, drop them in the comments on this episode's posts at the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter at Substack or the 5 a.m. Story Talk podcast account at Instagram. You can find links to both in the show notes, along with links to the Digital Rights Watch website and Lizzie's website, where you can read more about her work in advocacy. Don't make a run for it yet. You don't want to miss my bonus episode with Lizzie. She returns to discuss a foundational artwork from her life, Gustave Courbet's 1866 painting, L'Origine du Monde, or The Origin of the World in English. I described it as perpetually controversial earlier, and that's because it's a depiction of female genitalia that, despite its beauty, has shocked audiences for generations. It continues to shock some today, which is how it wound up at the center of a Facebook censorship lawsuit. You can find a link to the painting in the show notes, or just let Lizzie tell you about it. The best way to listen to this bonus ep is at Apple or the 5 a.m. Story Talk newsletter at Substack. Again, links in the show notes. A couple more things. If you enjoyed this episode, please take the time to leave a 5-star rating or if I had to choose between my children and 5 a.m. Story Talk, I'd choose 5 a.m. Story Talk every time kind of review on this podcast. It's a great no-cost way to support the arts and culture conversation we're having here. The other is, what's next at 5 a.m. Story Talk? Upcoming guests include screenwriter, novelist, and podcaster Emily St. James, cyborg anthropologist Amber Case, and musician Ben Lee. Every one of my guests have something to say about our world and the stories we tell. Be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss out. Thanks again for being here, Story Talkers. See you soon.